A pleasure to meet all at last, and today we are at it once again with the likes of the Vlog-A-Thon, mainly talking about various topics that I will have in mind for this series. I've combed through the likes of each year individually in 4 separate parts, but I have in fact made a few videos already for the Vlog-A-Thon that will in fact cover certain things in greater detail. But I feel like that if there's something else I could go on ahead and talk about here, it could very much be the entirety of last summer. Maybe the most specific thing about it is from start to finish, in which that it related to a good handful of trips. One handful in which that June alone had managed to cover was Lake Geneva, and more importantly, the lake itself, in which that a unique restaurant was there with some pretty killer food there. I mean, I got myself a couple of appetizers as well as some salmon as my meal, complete with the mojito cocktail. But on the other hand, we could talk about a supposed drive-through safari, which in fact allowed us to feed different animals with a few exceptions. But then we topped things off by heading over to the Kilwins. And as I mentioned before, there actually used to be a Kilwins over at the Bayshore Mall in Glendale, to the north of Milwaukee. But the thing is that since March of 2024, a couple weeks before I ended up having to go to the ER for thyroiditis, the thing is though, there was a Kilwins over at Lake Geneva, and I'm pretty satisfied with what we managed to get from that point in history. So I'd say that there's probably more that we could do Kilwins wise, but the one that's at Lake Geneva at least does well for what it is. But then of course we could talk a few things about the rest of the summer. One thing I hadn't really mentioned very much was the likes of Devil's Lake. This was yet another trip that we had put together, but my second grandfather ended up coming with me alongside. And it was a pretty big trip, I will say. It took over 2 hours to get there, and we had to drive our car on a ferry heading through the town of Merrimack, then eventually up to Baraboo, where Devil's Lake is, quite honestly, a pretty impressive display of nature. You got the lake itself, you got the nearby railroad tracks, which used to be a part of the Chicago and Northwestern, now run by the Wisconsin and Southern. And then of course you have the mountains themselves. The mountains of which that are typically above 1,000 or 2,000 feet high apiece. So, apart from Mount Horeb, a good chunk of Holy Hill, and some segments in the Ice Age Trail, I'd say that Devil's Lake and all of its unique pieces near Baraboo, including the mountains, are all pretty well made to a point in which that I'm more than confident to say we've hit a pretty big site here, well worth the visit. And for the record, I might head up on another trip with him in the future. But if we really wanted to cap things off here, well, if you want to talk about my 26th birthday, that'd be something else just as well. In fact, the Lake Geneva trip was more or less a big part of my 26th birthday. Alongside the party itself, where a number of things were given to me. A new pair of shoes, an air pair of headphones, and even some cash here and there. But to top things off, the very last week of June brought upon a couple of unique things. Yet another trip. Wow. What's wrong with me? Okay, well, there was yet another trip. In this case, though, we ended up making our way out to Nakusa, Wisconsin, which is further to the north, as opposed to west, like in Baraboo. What in this situation though, I had a lot of friends and I gone on there along with my brother for a cabin retreat weekend, that of which was accompanied by some golfing, some racing down the roads, and of course a pretty big day worth of fishing. So, but I will say another big highlight of that trip was a night spent at the Ho Chunk Casino, where I actually won pretty big at the time. So I can't really say that the trip itself was all the more eventful than everything else, but at the same time, it would make sense understanding that some people would derive themselves from the comforts of home in order to get out there and experience nature and wildlife and the many challenges that they have to offer. And finally, if we had to talk about one other notable thing about June 2025, a black tie reception. This, of course, was a pretty big one held by my brother's own family. And honestly, they killed it there. It was one hell of a way to wrap things up for the month of June. And overall, was probably one of the best Junes that I had in a while. So, I feel like it's enough said on that part. But if you're wondering about July and August, well, they weren't exactly as big. Some trips are notable in this segment, but if we really had to talk about anything else that happened that summer, how about the State Fair? Yeah, basically the State Fair in West Dallas that's held every August took place, but then wouldn't you know, there of course was a flash flood during the last few days. The crazy thing is that they were supposed to have Lynyrd Skynyrd perform in concert at the State Fair. But that ultimately didn't work out because of the floods. And I will say, the rest of the month in August was impressive. I mean, we were dealing with floodwaters all the way around. The streets were flooded, the parks were flooded. Some of the rivers basically overflowed enough to wash out most of the land. And I will say that the bug population grew immensely because of how moist the air and the land was. So, all of that basically compiles together into one impressive feat of historical significance. Oh, but then of course there are the movies, like The Bad Guys 2, amongst many other things. So, I will say that summer 2025 might have been one of the best and wildest that we've ever possibly imagined. I mean, a lot of trips, a lot of notable events, and of course some ups and downs as what's expected here. So, that's probably all I got to offer for this piece of the Vlog-A-Thon, but let's keep in mind, I will have more ups and downs to speak of in this instance here. So, make sure to like, subscribe, comment, follow me wherever you can find me, and stay on the Hollywood side for more.